All right, folks, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from today. And welcome to our webcast titled Discover How to Create Mainframe APIs in Minutes. Just in case you don't know me, my name is Len Thompson, and I'm Broadcom's Mainframe Division Community Manager. And again, I'd like to welcome you to today's session. Before I hand you off to our presenter, just want to let you know that we are recording today's session, which is why you're currently muted. If you have questions along the way, please use the questions box along the right side of the screen, and we'll get through as many of those as we can at the end. And if we have time at the end, I will also let you know at that time how you can have your line unmuted if you prefer to ask your questions that way. The recording for today's session will be posted in the Mainframe communities either later today or tomorrow, depending on how long it takes to finalize on the system. And the last thing for me is that we are always trying to ensure that these sessions are valuable for you. So with that in mind, at the end of this webcast, a little survey was going to pop up at the end. I'd really appreciate you taking a few minutes just to give us some feedback so we can make sure that our next session is even better. And with that out of the way, I'd like to hand things off to our presenter today, Tyler Band. So take it away, Tyler.
Excellent. Hi, everybody. My name is Tyler Band. I'm a principal engineer at Broadcom working on the Live API Creator product. And I'm going to be talking about mainframe APIs. And in a second, so I think there's two things I want to get across. One is that Live API Creator is a product that's part of the Layer 7 APIM product suite. So it's part of the gateway and the portal, and this is the creation piece of the life cycle. So when you're thinking about APIs or how you're going to connect your mainframe to your mobile devices or your web or your other systems, Live API Creator is just one piece of the puzzle. So what we like to talk about is this concept of low-code APIs or microservices. And microservices are really simply a way to modernize your architecture by simplifying how you integrate your mainframe data with other systems. So why are these microservices synonymous with modernization? I think the best way to orient this is to think of APIs as sort of the iceberg floating on the surface of the water, where the API itself is really just a small tip of the new architecture, because APIs themselves have been around for a long time. It's just that they change names, XML, SOAP, JSON, but at the end of the day, what makes them important as part of the life cycle is the logic, the integration, and the security that we provide under the sea. In other words, it's more than just some name value pairs being returned to another system. So what makes microservices interesting to the architecture of modern development is that these architectures are scalable and lightweight, which means that to stand up a small lightweight service that performs maybe a payment service or an order entry or order processing service, or maybe just returns some mainframe data that another system needs to make a decision. So as more requests come in, the systems can dynamically increase their scalability. They can increase their capacity without having to re-architect your whole system. They're also independent. They generally don't need or rely on any other systems or services. They're sort of self-contained, self-monitoring, self-regulating, and that independence allows them to be stood up quickly, integrated in with other systems. And by being loosely coupled, they work well with other systems. Sometimes we'll use messaging to go between systems, but generally it's a sort of request response, stateless environment. And finally, this singular focus, they only do one thing and they do it well. So when you're standing up these APIs or integrating, you're not trying to build these monolithic systems with thousands of tables and columns. You're just trying to solve a specific issue or specific problem with your microservice. So we talk about digital transformation and leveraging as sort of the tip of the iceberg. So when you're building new systems or integrating with new web or mobile backend systems, you need these APIs. And essentially, they're just HTTP requests made to a server that returns some information. But what makes Live API Creator and these microservices more interesting is that, first of all, they can support more than just a single database. So you can integrate multiple databases with just point and click. In other words, you can connect to your mainframe and to, say, another database and actually have these two coming back together as if they're a single response. Live API Creator has declared a spreadsheet-like logic. So formulas, events, validations, things that typically would have been done in the client code or in, say, triggers and stored procedures in the backend can now be done like a spreadsheet declaratively in your creation of your microservices. And there's a broad range of integration, which I'll show you during the demo. And finally, the most important piece is the role-based access control, or fine-grained security. What that means is that as you're building these services, at some point, you're going to have to decide who's going to have access to these endpoints. What can they do? Are these read-only? Can they update? And even further, in some situations, you may want to limit who can see which rows or which columns based on their security roles. So that fine-grained access is not an afterthought. It's part of this whole agility of building, designing, delivering, and deploying microservices. So I think what we've seen from many of our large customers is that what they see is speed and agility. So there's no need to, I mean, once you've connected to your mainframe data or your backend data, there is no compile, it's sort of instant time to value. Because these rules and this system is declarative, which means that it's more human readable, there's no code sort of centric. And what we've seen is that a 40x improvement in productivity. Projects that would take weeks or months can be done in hours or minutes, depending on the complexity. So what this means is there's a decrease in your total cost of ownership, not just in initial development, but through the full life cycle of building, testing, deploying, managing, and changing your APIs over time, because things do change. And because of the nature of how LAC, Live API Creator, is created, it integrates well with DevOps. There are command line tools for source control integration with all and each and every step. So the features, I guess, we'll see sort of in the demo that the instant enterprise-grade APIs, no compile, no deploy, instance live. What that really means is that once you put your credentials in for your mainframe access, usually a host or username, port, whatever, we'll scan the internal information and instantly build a collection of tables, views, and procedures that can then be further refined, but there's no compiling, there's no deploying. These things are instantly ready to go. So people are amazed at how quickly you can go from concept to production without having to know anything more than just a few connection pieces of information. And we've integrated with all of the major SQL and NoSQL databases, the mainframe, IDMS, Datacom, all of the DB2s, DB2ZOS, LUW, DB2 for I. We also have some cloud APIs for like Salesforce and SAP. We have integrations with various messaging services. And this makes the platform highly scalable and flexible in its design and development of how you want to solve very specific needs of API integration. Because of the declarative nature and the point and click of the tool, I'll be talking really sort of during the demo about different personas of people who, there are people who develop the APIs and then people who are going to test them, and then the consumers of the APIs usually are mobile or web-based backends or other systems. And finally, I talked about the role-based access control, which in governance and security, these are not afterthoughts, but it's built into the product. So you don't have to worry about, oh, what do I do about security? It's part of the lifecycle development. And finally, who's using LAC in your mainframe environment? And I would say that any place that currently where people want access to a piece of data without having to make a warehouse copy of the data, but they want live real-time access, they can easily connect to these data sources for read and write if necessary. We've seen people use these in distributed systems and even making calls and augmenting existing applications, like for COBOL or RPG programs. So let's talk about the architecture. So over here, Internet of Things apps, mobile apps, web-based applications, service bus architectures need access to your enterprise data. That data is locked in databases or web services or existing, even other existing APIs. Oops, I pressed the wrong button. So there's really three components of Live API Creator. There's the server. This will run in various containers. So developers will usually run a Jetty container for standalone on their desktop. It can be deployed as a WAR file, which means it can run on Tomcat or JBoss or any of the Azure or Amazon as a deployment WAR, or it can run in a Docker container. What that means is that once you've defined your API, everything is stored in a source-controlled repository, a file-based repository system. All the logic, the role-based access control, the integration services, all that data is stored in your admin repository, which then can be packaged in your container. Oh, keep pushing the wrong button. Once you've created your server, you can publish this to the gateway for security and rate limiting and other services, and you can publish to the portal, which gives developers ability to enhance who has access to and what they can do with their APIs. The piece I'll be demonstrating is called API Creator, and this persona, these are the people who own and develop APIs themselves. This is just a web-based graphical UI that manipulates and lets me see and define the server. And finally, there's another data visualization piece called Data Explorer, which lets me navigate the data and see the data live. So it dynamically creates views of tables, views, and relationships. So those are the three parts. So in summary, this is sort of what we'll be demonstrating is how to create RESTful APIs, how we can integrate across multiple data sources, how we can integrate with different services, and then write or supplement this data with logic and security. So I'll just click through here. So I'm going to skip out of here and I'm going to go into, save this for last. So when you first log into Live API Creator, this is the developer portal, if you will. And normally what you're seeing a bunch of tiles, and each of these represents an API or an API project, if you will. It contains a collection of definitions. If I wanted to create a new API, we have wizards that let us, depending on whether you want to write your APIs first and then code it first, or whether you want to use the database first. The database first says, I have all of the mainframe, IDMS or Datacom or Oracle or DB2. They're all pretty much the same. They ask for username, passwords, Informix, Teradata, and as I talked about before, Salesforce, SAP, or Jindy, which means that JNDI would be using your containers data connection in order to bring back information. I already have some APIs already predefined and set up, so I won't go through the process. I mean, what it would look like, let me just do it real time. So connecting to, testing the connection, and then saying continue. What it's done is it's gone through and quickly scanned the data source and said, I have 17 tables, 16 views, 10 relationships, no procedures. And what a developer would see is they would see that all of these endpoints suddenly would show up as available REST endpoints that can instantly be consumed. So all I had to do was just give it some meta information about how to connect, and the JDBC driver connects to the mainframe or the data source and scans the tables, views, and procedures to bring them back the meta information. So what that would look like, if I double click on it, it brings me into another tool down here called RESTlab. And RESTlab shows the URL that a developer would use, because this is running my local machine, local host, my port, and the endpoint. Okay, so think of this as sort of like Postman, or this is typically how developers would be testing their REST API. So what I did is basically, from a data source perspective, I simply connected to a data source, read in the schema, and now I instantly have information that I can test. Now, what's interesting about this is that most of our customers don't want to use the database as their REST endpoints, because databases differ, especially mainframe databases. Some of the older databases have naming conventions that don't really fit to human readable forms. So what we provided out of the box is something called resources. And what a resource is, it allows you to, I'll just do one very quickly. I'll pick customers. Now, by default, I can now say, well, tell you what, I don't want to see all these attributes. I only want to see the customer ID, the company name, and the contact, and maybe the address. And I'm just going to alias it out. And maybe even change it. So what I've done is I've taken a database table, and I'm now creating an alias for it, so that when I execute it, the shape and names that come back have been aliased. What's interesting about this is now, from a REST perspective, I can post to this aliased API, and it will de-alias it and send it back to the database correctly with the correct names. So I don't have to expose my database and its underlying architecture and its naming conventions. So what's even more interesting is that now, because I scanned the database, it knew that there's a relationship between customer and orders. And because it knew about customers and orders, I should be able to bring in the order details. But one of the things about the order details got this thing called product ID. And I'm just going to pick all the attributes. But I'm going to go here after product ID, and I want to bring in the parent value, the product name. So it's actually allowing me to navigate and do what we call a lookup. So now when I run this, I can quickly, and this is true whether it's in the same database or multiple databases, I can join across multiple databases. So I can bring data from the mainframe customers and join it to, say, an Oracle database by just giving it the relationship between the two. But notice that it brought the product name back as a lookup. What's interesting about this is that I can actually use that lookup when I post back to this object saying, I'm going to post this order with this product name, but I want you to use the product name to look up the product ID, and I don't want to expose my internal product ID. So LAC is pretty good at understanding the nature and hierarchy of relationships between data. So just to quickly summarize, in a couple of clicks, I was able to alias out my columns. I got to select which columns I want to produce. I could change any of this stuff, and I was able to do a lookup. And I did this all in 1 minute. So this is how you shape your APIs. And now at this point, this might be the resource. I'll call this customer with orders. So this would be the endpoint that I would publish, because now it's doing a 3-table join, bringing it out as a hierarchy or nested document. And all I had to do was just follow the normal natural relationships between customer and orders and order details. Okay, so that's sort of what I would call shaping the resource or shaping the endpoint. So if I'm going to publish this to my portal or to my gateway, probably the only things I want to publish are the things that I want people to consume. So we'll get into role-based access control in a minute. I wanted to show one more thing. I'm going to switch projects quickly to another project, and we're going to look at rules. So a lot of times people think of rules the same way I think about how a spreadsheet processes in Excel. I don't tell Excel what order of operations. I just say, hey, I want to sum these two columns, or I want to sum or add these two values together like a formula, or I want to do a validation to make sure that the customer's credit limit doesn't exceed their order amount. All these validations, derivations, and calculations are simple declarative logic, and it's written in a language that is, I wouldn't quite say 4GL, but we have code completion in here. So if I say I want the current row, which is just an object instantiation of the line item, and I press a dot, it gives me all of the attributes. So for most developers, this gives them a sense of what's available, what they can do, and how they can, and with little sample snippets of code. So I think that's pretty helpful for the developer who's writing this code. There's also help information that is provided, and quick start information is provided. So the developer, the person who's responsible for shaping this API, would be the person responsible for saying things like, I'm going to create a validation rule. What a validation rule does, it says, during this transaction, remember this is a transactional database. So whether it's a mainframe or Oracle or SQL Server, if the database supports transactions, this field called balance has to be less than the credit limit. Well, balance is a derivation of the sum of the purchase orders. So this is actually doing the live adjustments of the parent value. So it's as people are inserting or updating or deleting line items, the system internally is doing the adjustments of the parent's balance, and the balance then would then trigger the validation, which then would in turn decide whether to roll back the entire transaction, saying, hey, you've tried to buy too much stuff. I think we look, let me do this in Data Explorer. So I'm going to switch to the visualization tool. So using that same model, customers, purchase orders, and line items. So if I tried to buy 10,000 of these, I would get that validation. The customer's credit limit exceeds $9,000. So a $4 million purchase is probably too big. So this is the message that would come back to the API consumer if they tried to insert or update a value that exceeded the validation logic. And this is really helpful because validations can take all sorts of forms. This field can't be null if this value is here. This value has to be within a certain range. So all of the kinds of formulas, validations, derivations that one would consume in a spreadsheet can be done declaratively. And again, there's no compile. Once I've made the change to the rule is live and it's available for testing instantly. Okay. So I'm going to do a couple more things in ResLab. So one of the things that people ask about or have asked us for over the time is when I do a get, you'll notice that there's something called a checksum. And what a checksum is, it's the calculation or the hash of the values before change. So if I'm going to delete a record or I'm going to update a record, I have to provide the checksum so that it will do the optimistic locking, in other words, validation before the change is accepted. And that's really helpful because in a mainframe world, you want to minimize the cycles between the LAC server and the database. So you don't want to send this to the database and have the database reject it because somebody else has changed the values underneath. So what we do is we'll reread the record, check the checksum and say, hey, somebody else has changed this value while you were sleeping. Okay? Now sometimes people want the data in different formats. They may want it in CSV format. They may want it in XML format. And again, this is really a flavor choice. So it's the same rules, the same endpoints. It's just that all I had to do is just tell it that I want to modify the response format to some other style. So depending on, and the other thing that LAC does out of the box is it does pagination. So if I say I want a page size of 1, starting at row 20, I'll only get back 1 record, but the page size and offset are automatically determined. And this could be really important for bringing back data from a mainframe. You may not want to bring back every single row in a database. So what we'll do is we'll wrap it and make sure that we only bring back the page size you've requested. Sometimes you want more page size, like if you're bringing back a list of valid states, you may want all 50 states rather than the first 20 with a page size offset. So this is all controllable through the URL itself. And of course, there's filtering that can go on. Filters are really nothing more than a way of saying, I want to look for a name that's equal to some specific value or a balance greater than 5,000. And of course, you can also provide sorting information. So that is the developer's toolbox for designing, developing APIs. Once these APIs are created, they live in a file system which can be checked into your GitHub. So the file system, your APIs are stored under a name, and that project name, all of the things you've declared, your data sources, are all stored in JSON or JavaScript files that can be checked into GitHub. Now, what's interesting about this is that now you can package these things up and that packaging can then be deployed as part of your life cycle. So all of this information now can be handed off to your DevOps and saying, this is a complete API project, please move it to QA or test or production. Okay. And I think the last thing I want to talk about is role-based access control. So role-based access control is something that, when we do that, I'll just say this sort of as an aside, Live API Creator as a product uses its own, we actually built this whole product in Live API Creator itself. In other words, it's bootstrapped on itself. So we use our own REST endpoints. We have our own database under the covers. We have our resource endpoint defines. We use role-based access control to build this API Creator UI. So in other words, we use LAC to build LAC. So typically, you have different roles. So when a user logs in, or you grant access to the system, you determine what their default permissions are going to be. Sales rep might have no default permissions, but may have very specific permissions to read only certain tables, or sales rep can only see their own orders, their own purchase orders. So the syntax is a little strange, but it basically says for this table, when this employee logs in, the authentication grabbed his employee ID and made sure from that tenant he can only see his own record. So he can't see the boss's orders or his teammates' orders. The other thing you can do is you can decide which endpoints that they can see. So you can have that fine-grained access. So by default, this role can't see anything except the two tables that I've marked. But as an API owner, I might be able to see all of those endpoints. So again, this is done sort of as part of the deployment and runtime of your life cycle of your API. So when you're thinking about your APIs, you start with, where's the data coming from? That's your connection. You get to see all of your tables, views, and procedures. And then you decide how you want to shape them by creating, I guess we call these document style interface. So one request can bring back your customers, your orders, your items, and your lookups in a single request. And you can alias and de-alias this stuff on. Rules are then the thing that control when a transaction occurs, inserts, updates, and deletes. And finally, RESTlab is the tool we use This is a tool that we use to sample the data because it's sort of built into the product. And then the final piece of the puzzle would be the logging. And again, the logging, when you're talking about logic transactions and rules, it's important to be able to see what's going on under the cover. So all this logging information gives you information about the queries that are executed, what they look like, what parameters are passed in, how long it took, for 4 milliseconds. So again, I don't want to belabor that, but as a developer building APIs, it's nice to be able to point and click and quickly get results like this without having to write any code. There are some other pieces of our world that we don't normally talk about too much, but there are things that we can do. We can create connections and listeners. These are tied to external messaging queues. So for example, if I want to create a connection, we have connections to Kafka, RabbitMQ, DB2 JMS, MQTT. And once you've created your connection to that queue, you can add a listener, and those listeners are tied to those message queues. And that can be very helpful because you can be listening for specific messages. And when those messages occur, you can then trigger events in LAC. For example, a message comes in, you could write that to a database. Or whenever somebody makes a change to a particular table, you could write an event to publish a message to a message queue saying, hey, somebody just updated this table. And then timers are what you think they are. They're basically just event-based schedule that executes a piece of code. So sometimes you may want to poll a remote system saying, the remote system doesn't have a webhook to inform me when a change occurs. So I'm going to say, every 5 minutes, I'm going to go out to that system, I'm going to go out to that system and make a call and then take that response and determine what it's doing to then trigger some event inside of LAC. So that's timers and listeners. So I don't think I'll try to delve too much deeper, but other than to say that the three parts of the product, the server, which is the runtime piece, the creator, which is a piece the developers see, and the data explorer, which is, I use it for two reasons. I use it to navigate my data, so I can drill down and navigate across different objects and see sort of what the values are. I can use it for inserting sample data. And I use it for testing my rules. So what happens then is my rules, I want to test to see if they work. You saw when I did the customer validation, but it's very helpful to have and again, I didn't create this UI. This UI was automatically, dynamically created from the metadata about the schema that was created when I connected to either the mainframe or any data source. So Live API Created Data Explorer knows how to generate this, and it has some authoring mode, so you can remove fields or add fields or do lookups and cool stuff like that. So it's really a neat tool, really not designed for production. It's really meant for back office and for users who just quickly need to see the data and maybe make a few quick changes. So it's been useful. I think that's about all I want to say about that. So the documentation is available online. So most of this information, installing, configuring, creating, securing, and managing, and all this information is available to you as part of the product set, just as same as IDMS and Datacom. So all of this DocOps stuff is available to customers, and there's a free trial and download. So if you're interested in Live API Creator or any of the APIM demos, it should be here somewhere. So I think it's in there's a link for it somewhere in the slide deck. And I think with that, Lynn, are there any questions that I can answer at this point?
Thank you, Tyler. There aren't any questions at this point, folks. If you do have questions, please either use the questions box on the right side of your screen, or if you would like to ask your question verbally, please just raise your virtual hand. There's a way to raise your hand and go to webinar, and I can unmute your line for you. So we'll give everyone a minute to do one of those things if they would like to. And I should also mention, also as part of that survey that I mentioned at the beginning of our session, which will pop up when I close the webcast, there is a place where you can ask questions in there as well, and I will make sure that Tyler and the team sees that. All right, we don't have any questions. I guess we can wrap up today. So thank you everybody for your time. We really appreciate it. And for those of you in the US, have a great holiday weekend, and we will talk to you soon. Thanks.
Thank you all. Appreciate your time.